Okay, my name is Stephen Sones. This is 8:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, room 31, and we are discussing the Great Sending as it relates to many things, including COVID and dealing with pandemics. So, a lot of today, what I want to talk to all of you about, and just so anyone who happens to listen in on this is curious, I had the group talk a little bit about who they were and where they're from and how COVID affected them in their context as kind of a backdrop to our conversation today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, a little bit about COVID, get into also just why is the Great Sending in general a good lens for dealing with anything that comes along, because this is not going to be our last crisis or our last pandemic. And I think it's important for us to understand how we address life issues. So we'll do that. So Steve Sones, I'm at a North Houston suburban church. I hate to call it suburban because we don't really have cities up where I'm at. We're called Spring. There's no true Spring, Texas, except for if you go over, there's a post office on the east side of the highway. And I think in the days of the railroad, there's an old whorehouse that's on the track that is surrounded now by various things going on with mostly shopping. So if you want to go get antiques and kill 3 days and a lot of money, you can go there. We're mostly subdivisions that are hooked together who each have their own rules, each have their own groups and boards. Water districts are more powerful than anybody else because they can tell who can come and go. And there's absolutely zero zoning laws, so you can build almost a car lot next to a house if no one's there to control it. So that's the wildness. And you can have homes that are, well, when we moved there, they were worth $50,000, and then those next door could be homes worth $500,000. Now, in today's context, with the recent situation going on, those $50,000 homes are worth $200,000, and the $500,000 are worth $1 million. So that's kind of the area we live in. It's a fast-growing area. It is a place that we are. The greater Houston area, when we moved there, was about 4 million. I think it's around 7.5. I think I had read it was going to go up to 12, but now I'm reading 14 million is where the Houston area is going. I know that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with COVID, but it has everything to do with how the church goes about thinking about mission and how we go about life. So when COVID hit, like everyone else or most people, we had never streamed a service in our life before. And so by the first Sunday, we had 8 cameras sitting up, which were phones tied to a little box that could let you switch from camera to camera. And we started into the life of creating and producing church on television, and went with that for a while. There were a handful of churches, not necessarily Lutherans, in the area who just went with the political end of, this is just Big Brother, we will have church, we don't care what anybody says. So it was interesting to see how some people didn't care if they were Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian. Suddenly their theology was Assemblies of God because those people are open, and that's what we're going to. And it was interesting, those people have stayed, and how many people don't really care what the theology is. They just wanted a place that will fight conspiracy theories and everything else, whatever they feel is the world. For us, we went for that with a while, started to come back, and then everything tightened up again in the greater Houston area. If you're not familiar with it, like from Kansas, another odd thing is our county is heavily mandated by a county judge who's not really a judge. But she made the rules, and there was fights between her and the governor on how much she could tell people not to get out, churches closed, what could stay open. And so we've kind of been through that over time. And I would say Texas, for those of you who are not from Texas, Texas still has had a brand of we don't care, we'll do what we want. And so I would say that despite pushes of county judges and certain people, that things started opening up much quicker. So we've been back in place for a while. We did do the For a while, the every other pew, we had seats spaced off by 6 feet with a dot on the pew where you could sit, and of course if you had families and did all that. I don't think that's as important to us as this, and that would be, who is the church and how do we live that out? One of the concerns I had, and I think it's influenced, the people who were at this conference have been bugged to death by, do you have this book? Did you get your book yet? Type of thing. And I think pre-COVID and during COVID, the question that has continued to come to my mind is this, is not how you arrange things, how you do worship, how you do pandemics, so much as what are the lenses, what are the ways that we look at the church. And I believe that one of the things that we as Christian leaders, and if we're Christian leaders, need to be thinking about whenever you come across something is, what is the narrative? What are the words that we use to speak about who we are and what we're about? So I think one of my concerns became, I heard from many around us, and I talked to lay people from other places, and they say, well, we closed church. We've closed church. We don't know when it will be open again. Heard those phrases. They closed the church. The church is closed. And my concern is with when we start thinking about things in those ways is that it tells us a couple of things. It tells us, first of all, that if we think church is only worship on Sunday morning, and that's who we are and where we are, we already have a problem. Because the church is more than Sunday morning worship. Very important, not taking that away, but it's more than that. And if we set that narrative, my concern is, what will the church be doing with themselves? So let's go to the book of Acts. We could go to the Old Testament with the Babylonian dispersion. We could go to the book of Acts with the dispersion of Christians throughout. If people had been living in Jerusalem and had been dispersed to Philippi or to Corinth or wherever, and started saying, well, the church has been closed, that would be problematic in terms of, or if Paul would have said, well, we can't go out because the church has been closed. The problem with that is we begin to see circumstances running reality. The reality of what God was doing is he was taking something which was not seen as good or helpful and utilizing to the best. The church grew and spread as Paul, through the missionary journeys, as Christians were spread out, as it went beyond the walls of Jerusalem, provided opportunity for the gospel to be spread and go further and further because of those circumstances. When the church in Rome and those other cities were finding that Christians were being killed for their faith, I'd be curious for them not only what we have from God's Word, but what was the narrative? Because what we know what happened was that Christians who sacrificed and gave themselves up for the gospel's sake greatly influenced the people that they were around, to the point where we know that there were Christians in Caesar's household, in which the overwhelming move of the church under persecution became an opportunity by which the church grew so much that it became known as the Holy Roman Empire at a later date. Now, personally, I don't think that was a good thing, but that's another story. But the fact that the preponderance of people, and especially important people, became Christian, it changed the movement of the world. And so, as Christians, when we see anything coming up, I don't care if it's a political issue of the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, pandemics, masks, not masks, vaccines, not vaccines, do we meet, don't we meet, how do we handle that? I don't know that there's always lots of answers. If the governor says you cannot meet, do we say, no, we are the church, we will? Hard conversation. We must wear masks. Hard conversation. People who still want to come to church, and we've had this where some are at church with no mask and others are coming in wearing masks. Everybody feels weird. It's like, I wish I had a mask on, or sometimes it's, who can read eyes? Are you looking at me because you're thinking, you idiot, you don't have a mask on, or you fool, you have a mask on? You know, all those odd feelings that we're going through people in church, but also in stores. I go through Kroger or H-E-B, and you run across somebody with your same aisle. Well, you're smiling behind your mask. How do they know you're not looking at them like, you fool, how'd you cut me off? And we've seen the pressure cookers in society and the pressure cookers in church and the emotional sense of things going up and down. And to me, when I think about all that, what does the church, what did God open the church to do? And here's the thing I think that we want to convey. So let me, before I talk about pandemics, let's just talk about this book, The Great Sending. So for those of you who received one, wonderful. If there's those of you hearing this who weren't here and you'd like one, you can buy one on Amazon. That's great if you want to pay $16. If you want to order from me, you have to get a case, but I can get it for you much cheaper. This is not a sales advertisement, but I'm just telling you if you're interested. But the idea of the Great Sending and the idea of this book was not born out of a pandemic, but it was born out of a concern that the church has lost its way. It's interesting with the LCMS, and I actually have a document by the writer of this book, Will Soanes, where he went through from the beginnings of our synod and began to look at the documents, sermons of Walther, convention conversations, what was happening at conventions that were the primary reasons for coming together. And you can watch a significant change of where our church body was solely focused on mission, and even our Constitution reflected an interest first and foremost on items of mission, although we were doctrinally based. And then what you watch over time was there were certain situations, certain circumstances that took place where all of a sudden our Constitution has changed. But not only that, you begin to see the essays at the conventions, you see the resolutions at the conventions, all become focused on disagreements over theology and doctrine. Now again, we are Lutherans, right? We care a lot about theology and doctrine, but it's interesting that our swing came from being, we are theologically aligned, we agree on the Bible and everything we are, to basically we're going to find something that distracts us from the mission of the church. The heaviness on my father's part, who's 89 years old and lived through that, and admittedly will tell you he was part of the distractions because he was very engaged in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and forward, saying, how do we keep purity in doctrine? I would tell you that what I've always appreciated about him was that his interest in purity in doctrine was always matched by, if not exceeded by, doctrine is the means, not the ends. My words, not his. And that the mission of the church is the most important. So, as you read the book, and I really would encourage you to read the book, is to go forth with it and begin to see if our lenses have us looking at life and church and work and mission in a way that we have impacted things, including the pandemic. And I'll go on with that in a second. But John, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just say one more thing about your dad, that I think, as a young guy coming out, and I was really blessed to have a lot of conversations with him at different times and contexts. It's another really key thing, and your dad is probably the consummate churchman of any pastor of that era, and especially with his leadership in Wyoming and everything else. He is the absolute consummate churchman. And that really seems to me that that's probably one of the big things also out with the pandemic is the importance of community. And so I would say that the focus on the things we do and how we do it takes us away from focus on each other. And so I think there's a focus on people out there that don't know Jesus, but also within the church, a focus on people. So when you talk about mass, no mass, all those different things, it's because we see them either as positions or other things, but we don't see them as people. And I think one of the things that we really pushed on for us is we saw pretty quickly that we need to emphasize community. And so throughout the pandemic, we have been emphasizing community. And with the understanding that we have to be a strong community in order to be a sending congregation and reach out. But to me, that's actually one of, I think, the strongest things of your dad. He's such a churchman because he sees people as people and engages with them. That reflects that we really are people. So,
Thank you, John. And I know too, over my years of growing up in the house, he would comment on when the church became belly gazers, is a phrase I remember him saying. And, it's easy to become a belly gazer, isn't it? If you're in Kansas and churches are shrinking and you're thinking, how do we get through this? If you're trying to revive. Belly gazer means you're not looking outward. You're just looking at your own belly button. And so when we're gazing at our own belly button, I probably should have said belly button gazer, but when we become a belly button gazer, what happens is we lose sight of, what God's calling is. And so the book really establishes itself on the sending dynamic, and it is an amazing feature, even to utilize the word sending, and you start reading that with that in mind, of God's sending and how God sent Old Testament to New Testament. Even Adam and Eve, if you think about it in Genesis, God sent them. It was an act of law or grace when he sent them out of the garden. Well, before them, but we'll go to the point of sin. He sends them out of the garden. Is that an act of law or grace?
Yes.
It's yes, because it was law. They had forsaken the covenant, and yet it was a piece of grace, which both was for their own salvation because of the danger of what was there left, but also it was a dynamic of putting them into, that God was sending them into the world because of the promise in Genesis 3, that from that seed, that proto-evangelion or whatever that is, and so that aspect of grace of God, but in that sending. And if you think about along the way, Abraham sent, right? David, even in terms of his own story, you can break it down into various sendings. Moses, in his various sendings. By the time we get to Jesus himself and his birth and Christmas, and what happens? His parents are sent. Jesus is with his parents to Egypt, sent. And Jesus refers to himself a lot of times within that aspect of sending. And of course, the greatest piece of this is just simply in John, a couple places. One is when Jesus prays with the Father and talks to him about the ones that he gave him because he was sent and that they would be sent. John 19, later in John 21, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And here would be and Dad does a much better job in the book, but I kind of get itchy when people talk about, the main verse that we need to talk about is Matthew 28. But we've commonly done that. What do we know about the mission of the church? Well, it says, Jesus said, go and make disciples. So there's a couple problems with that phrase immediately. First of all, he does not say imperatively go. The phrase there is actually, as you are going. And what happens is if you're really seeing that within the aspect of Jesus sending word, I have sent you, now as you are going, even the making of disciples and all the things that come within that context of those words are still within the underlying sentness. And so sometimes what happens is we even get caught up in Matthew 28 in a way that our lens is shifted a little bit, because even disciple making becomes and can become a belly button gazing activity. baptism, a belly button gazing activity. To be sent, and first and foremost, is understanding that this is a dynamic of all of the church, each person, that being the major subject and the major heart of God is to be one who sends, that the church is always going to be impacted by that. So in the early church, when there is dispersions, when there is persecution, when our German and Wendish, thank you, forefathers come into this country. For those of you not from Texas, there's always, you should remember, besides Perry County, the great, immigration was the Wends from Germany into Texas, just so you know. That's, what's that?
Lee County.
And specific, well, they passed through Houston on their way to Lee County, and some of them dropped off at your church, John. Don't you have those who still...
Yeah, they went to Lee County and then they came back.
They went to Lee County and then came back and still had their farm, so they go back and forth.
In Texas, if you've heard of Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation, in Texas it's 1 degree of separation with Lee County. Every church has somebody who knows somebody who's probably related to somebody from Lee County.
This is true. So Lee County, Texas wins. Everyone has a connection. It's an amazing thing. If you go to the Concordia, Texas campus, you will find the bell for the boat that sank that brought the winds over, and people care about whose name was on which boat lading that came over at what time. I'm just telling you, very important stuff. But here's the thing is, if you see what I think we look at oftentimes, the winds coming here or Perry County coming here, or if we want to go up to Michigan and care about the Francos. Oftentimes is seen as a leaving, a losing, a fleeing. What if we look at it as a sending? And I will tell you, it does make a difference. My own home area, although, I'm Wendish 7th, 8th, I don't know where the one German got in there, but when I look at my family history, my parents live in Tea Grove, Texas. Now, if you don't look up TEA like the drink, it's THE, but you say it properly, Tea Grove. So those folks, because of the number of family members, situations, you had people who moved away from the Lee County area, including my grandfather, and they treated it as being sent. Not just sent to go find a new place for their home and a family, but that group of people went and began to establish a church without a pastor. And before they even thought about a pastor, they built the church. And then what came after that was the idea, we'll find a circuit rider who came through once a month for serving of communion. But it wasn't this forlorn idea of, well, all we have is, or the church is closed, or anything else. It was the idea of being sent into that area as Christians to make a difference. Now, if we could have that idea today, that we are being sent, how many churches are going downhill? The biggest concern is number of churches that are shrinking. I would contend that our problem is we've lost the sense of being sent in our Lutheran churches, so that what we belly button gaze as to who do we have versus who is out there. You can't tell me there are people that are not disconnected from Jesus. When I went to Iowa, I had a dual parish, and I remember I had a smaller church. Of course, in those days, small churches, when I came out of the seminary, each had about 100. Now, if you say small church to a seminary student, they each have 20. Okay, changes in church world versus not. But I remember talking to the more rural parish, and I said, so how do we reach people who don't need Jesus? And they said, Pastor, everybody out here has a church. I said, really? Yeah. I said, you don't know anybody who's disconnected from Jesus or the church. I didn't quite use that phrasing, but it's the one I use today. No. So people started coming to worship there, and they said, I thought they had a church. I thought they went to church. The problem was not that there weren't availability of people to reach. The problem is our lens by which we do not look and see what Jesus sees. Luke 10:2, pray to the Lord of the harvest. The harvest is what? Right. He didn't say, hey, everybody's got a spot. It's plentiful. Our lens is the problem. Yeah, John.
Yeah, when I was in Lee County in days, and it's a county of about 15,000 people. I was at a church that was 1,500. We were the county majority Lutherans, and the mindset was everybody has a church. So one year, I contacted every church, Lutheran and otherwise, in the county to get what their Easter attendance was. Thinking that's the biggest Sunday, that's where the most. It was still less than 50% of the county.
Yeah.
But that was a way to give them an actual visual, because they all thought that exact same thing. I heard that so many times. And when I showed them those numbers, and they realized, well, not everybody in the church.
So we have not been a Christian society for a lot longer than we've thought. And I think our problem has been is we had a lens during the quote-unquote churched era that everyone was churched. And it's only been lately when the church has lost its status within the community of politics, within the community of status, that we've said, uh-oh. So today we hear horrible numbers from Barna and others. One of our conversations we had earlier from two of our gentlemen, they emphasized how many people haven't been coming back to church and may never come back to church. If you ask George Barna what's going on, there's a significant number of people who will never return, from what we can tell. They're not just gone until the mask goes away or they get their third shot or whatever. Something has gone on within people to say, maybe I don't need church. And I don't think they're even streaming or on the radio. I think what has happened is this pandemic has changed the idea of where does worship and church and family and community fit within my life. And so for us, what we ended up talking about is church is not closed. I said we will never use that word. We still gather. We gather online. But more importantly, God is providing you an opportunity. What are you doing in your neighborhood? Now, this is a hard leap for Lutherans. I don't know if it's because of our Germanness or our Wendishness or whatever. We have a hard time stretching out to the people who live near us. And I'm starting to figure out it shouldn't just be when we use the word neighbor, the person who has a line next to my fence. It may be my neighbor is the people who swim with my kids at the pool, or who are at the soccer field, or who play backgammon at the, in the hallway at the assisted living. When Jesus asks, the question gets asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor? Along this descending lens, we need to figure out who is our neighbor. But a lot of that shutting down idea, I think, just again put into people. So where does the church have the potential if we have that lens of being sent? First of all, we're not waiting at the church that they will come because we're still being sent. Secondly, sending is not just around the church. It's out of our home and our life. How does that look? So for those of you, I guess I'll have to download this, but I have here number 1 on your sheet. Lens makes all the difference in the world. Was a COVID a shutdown or an opening up? And we may have done a great job with this, or we may have gotten caught up in the whole we're shutting down. But I would suggest to you that in the next 10, 20 years, as we look at church, not just for pandemics, not just for other things, we need to figure out how to build a narrative into our churches that we are continuing to open up. If we're really going to be countercultural, we need to go out elsewhere. The church that John used to be at, I've had a little dealings with lately, and it's interesting because it's a significant church, the significant church in that county, significant school. And as I went there and found out how people think about them, I found out that people feel that those church people feel that they are much higher than the rest, that they do not connect in the community because if you're not in that church, you're nobody, and they're there for themselves. Now, I could say that about any church. I'm just telling.
It's especially true there.
And it's especially true there. So I talked to the pastor of the church, who's a wonderful man, who's just doing some great things there. But I remember having a conversation with him, and my first question is, what are you doing for the school? Now, I specifically didn't get too specific about more than school. They have a school, so obviously what he would do, because he's a pastor of church with a school, he started talking about what they do for the Lutheran teachers. And after he was done, I said, thank you, that's not what I meant. What are you doing for that school? And he looked at me and he said, that's a public school. I said, yep. What is this church doing for that school? Never thought about it. Let me give you another story. We have a gentleman who's in our area, was an MMF for many years. He was down in Bernie area a number of years ago. I think it was Bernie where the fires were. Or was it New Braunfels? Bastrop, thank you, Bastrop. That area, homes were burned out. Did they lose their home? I don't even remember. Lou and Martha? Yes. They lost their home. And what he observed going through that himself and watching churches respond is that it struck them that we are really good at taking care of our own. We are really bad at noticing the needs of the community. Now, we should take care of our own, but what has happened, Lou and Martha travel the country where there's been disasters, and he will call pastors and say, hey, how's everything going here in, fill in the blank. Everything's fine. Nobody was affected. I'm seeing here in the paper that thousands lost their homes, or hundreds, but none of our people did, so we're fine. And Lou says, well, what's your church doing for the other people? And the answer's like, we just told you we're fine. What do you mean? I know we're really good people, but it seems like we have a lens that stops at care with each other. How do you point outward? So I'm talking about everybody else. How about my congregation? Same like everybody else. We talked about stuff. A big turning point for us was Harvey that changed our lens of being sent. Harvey came through and dropped, if you remember hearing stories, 50, 60 inches of water. There were people impacted, and of all things, their senior pastor got flooded with 38 inches of water. Okay? People, of course, responded. Before we knew it, we had dozens and dozens of people at our house, which was great. But we looked around the neighborhood and saw dozens of houses. We only needed so many who could tear out sheetrock, throw everything we ever owned out in the front yard. So people began to go house to house and carry out their furniture and help tear out their walls. And they kept coming back. We had one neighbor who actually made the news because when they were supposed to leave, they had some birds and animals, and we said, we got to get out of here. Well, as it ended up, they had to send a boat to them, and they had to put their bird cages in boats and their dogs. And a news person made the mistake as they were pulling them off the boat in the dark with lights shining in their face. So how does it feel like to be flooded? She said a lot of words I can't repeat, and that they didn't have a way to blip off the screen. So to my knowledge, she's gotten the most words in online of any person ever in the history of broadcasting in Houston. But what was fascinating there, because we had talked to him some before, but when we went back, this lady shared her heart with Ursula and said, here's the deal. And she went through, I won't go through her life of what she's experienced, but her decision was God has always had something out for her. She doesn't know why God hates her so much. And as she was getting on that boat, she was probably saying to God what she was saying to the world. And when she came back, she said, I looked across the street and I realized the pastor got flooded. That was mind-blowing to her. could not figure that out because it didn't fit the paradigm. It didn't fit the lens she had. And it certainly didn't fit the lens that she had that church people came in and helped carry out her mattresses and help feed them. It didn't fit her paradigm that anybody associated with God would have anything to do with her. Now, we'd had in our heart a little bit about being sent to our neighborhood when we moved there. Because I'm a pastor. I spend all my time with church people. Most of my life, I have lived in neighborhoods and rarely gotten to know anybody who I live near. Because I have busy Jesus things to do. Too busy for Jesus to look at who lives next to me. The combination of the flood and I think this book reminded me that I could stand in the pulpit and say, reach out to your neighbor. I could indicate it's good to know and who's the people who are disconnected with Jesus, but until you start living with them and you feel like you need to make time to be sent to them, you never really understand the words of Jesus who says, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Now here's the other reason we Lutherans don't like to deal with people disconnected from Jesus, I think. We don't want to see who they are, but if we do, they're really messy. This couple was super messy. And I remember when we talked to them early on, did not want to at first talk about God. Well, then once we went over a couple times and we'd invite them back and forth, and painful people to be with. I mean, not easy folks to hang out with. It was like, okay, Lord, just give me the strength. Here we go. And then, I'd be in the kitchen and she'd be mixing an adult beverage, hot chocolate, of course. And she'd say, okay, I just want to ask you some questions about God. Of course you do. Every time you get me by yourself, you got God questions. Now here's the thing, I didn't always answer them because being sent doesn't mean I'm always giving her everything she wants, but sometimes I would say to her, I'd say, I think there's a deeper question you're trying to ask me, so why don't you think about this? And I'm not going to answer that question. I want you to think about what's really going on within you that asks you questions like, why do good people, all those kinds of things. And we just kept loving him. He had surgery. We took breakfast over on Thanksgiving. We took some adult beverages that go with orange juice, and they said, you're the funnest Christians we've ever known. And they moved, and it was funny because when they moved, every person who came to their house, including their realtor, they had to bring over to introduce them to us. And they said, come and see these people. No one's loved us like they have. Which was a little overwhelming because don't think we were all that great. What it told me is that in a world that people sit back and do nothing, in Houston, Texas, unlike maybe in Kansas you have this. I remember growing up in areas where there used to be front porches, and people sat on their front porch and they talked to their neighbors. In Houston, you build your man caves and you build your super duper areas that's behind a moving gate. You come home, you open the gate, you go in, you open your garage door, you go in, you go inside, you come out in your swimming suit and you sit at your pool and you say, thank you, Lord, that I have my quiet place. And people hide from each other. And I know that because when we started to keep getting to know our neighbors, we had to introduce people who'd been living next to each other 12 years. Didn't know each other. So see, the sending dynamic, I think, has something to it, not only in terms of obviously the gospel, but when the gospel comes, what it does is it changes your view of people, but then it also changes their view of God, because God's not sitting back waiting for you to come to him. God is coming to you through the lives of people and who they are. So what we talk about is where you work, live, and play. So One of the shifts with Harvey and some of the things that we're going is because of churches like I described in a small town in Texas. I've been to some others in bigger towns, and I used to ask people the question before GPS, I can't find such and such a church, Grace Lutheran Church. I don't know. I'm confused by this map. I cannot. Brenham. I asked and asked. Nobody had a clue. Huge church, huge school. Nobody knew where to find it. Finally, I get a block away at a gas station, and I said, does anybody know where this church is? No idea. So I get out. I'm thinking, where the heck is this church? I pull out and go around. I could see it after I pulled out of the parking lot. And I thought, how, of 12 people, including the person running the desk, did nobody know where this church was? So the question for us became this, and this is a pandemic question, I think. I think this is a day-to-day question. This is who are we question was, if we disappear tomorrow, who would miss us? Because if you're sitting and waiting, obviously nobody knows that you're there. The question that this book asks, the question of 42 Bible studies that are written here by the Dale Myers and Jerry Kieschniks, Ken Hennings, Paul Meyer, just wonderful, great churchmen, is driving us to ask the question, how has God sent me? So what Harvey did, and this is a God thing, this is not we're more pious or wonderful Lutherans than anybody else. It's just that God drove us to a place we hadn't been ready to go. So the only school flooded in our whole district was one just blocks from our church. Remember the question, where's your school? They couldn't be in there for a year. They had to move to a high school that hadn't opened yet. So we started showing up, and I remember the principal, we showed up, and she looked at me like, oh, great, a church. And I'll tell you why she thought that. Because I'm walking up and down the hallway, and people from Michigan and Minnesota and places who want to help places in Texas has sent tennis shoes. Now remember, this is an elementary school. I'm looking at the size of the tennis shoes. They were all 12s and 13s. And they're having to store these in the hallway of their school. So she says, so what did you bring? Didn't bring anything. We came to get your list. What do you want? Well, our art room has no art supplies. We need the following. We'll hand these out to your teachers. We'll be back in 2 days. Came back. She's like, okay. Oh. She was a little cold for quite a while. Liked that, but she was overwhelmed. PTSD. She was just... So this school had water come in from the ceiling, and then had water come up from the bottom. They had to tear out, redo the whole school. So as they were getting closer to move in, called her up and said, Kathy, what do you need? And I almost could hear her say, and then she said, well, we have to move into the school. We have boxes, and we have parents coming in. And I said, so what do you need? Well, I need 8 people to help with boxes, and we need 60 pizzas. Okay. Got them. So we showed up, and in the extra little gym, we had all the pizzas delivered and stuff, and had been helping unload. And she comes over to me for the first time, not looking like, why are you in my school? And she came up to me, she said, I guess you're like adopting us, huh? I said, you could call it that. I said, so here's the rule. Anything you ask for in the next year is always a yes. Don't care what it is. You ask, you get it. If you don't ask, I'm going to call you and ask you what you didn't ask for. The shift, it wasn't just me, I'm talking about me for the moment, but the shift wasn't just me, it was people saying this is our school. So they needed mentors, so we showed up with 14 mentors who would sit with kids every day. We took breakfast to the teachers once a month on Friday. when they called and said our teachers are, and I can't tell you after a flood how it affects educators, you know how it does with pandemics. We took them gifts. We sent prayer cards around. We thought they'd go, oh great, oh my gosh, we got the most amazing prayers. And I think the shift for us became, and as this book came out, to understand that they'd been there the whole time. We had never felt sent to go to where they were and find out what they needed. So she goes on Facebook later and talks about our church. They have a dedication and the community is invited, and she said, you have to be here. I get there and there's this big PowerPoint slide saying, thanks to Resurrection Lutheran Church. Now there's these other churches there. I'm like, Kathy, please take that down. Nope. She opens up, she says, are you going to have the opening prayer? Prayer? Sure. She introduces me and she says, well, I want Pastor Sullins to be able to pray because his church, and she went through and the teacher stood up and clapped. It was overwhelming. More so because I realized how many years that I've spent not looking at the people that God has sent us to. We take food to the constables. I know their roll call is at 2 o'clock, so I better get the food there by 1:30. I can meet both shifts coming and going. It's great because they also use our parking lot and they come in and they sit. The K-9 Sheriff's Department comes over and trains their dogs. The one thing I wish they didn't do is SWAT comes over and they suit up to go somewhere, and people always think that we're being attacked at the church. Pastor, the SWAT's there. What's going on? It's okay. They're just getting dressed to go to your house. You're fine. But the sense that we're getting is that every time we learn of something, there's something else that we didn't realize we were sent to. So the book has Bible studies. The book has a catechism about the mission of Christ. The book has some wonderful things that encourage us to open our eyes and have a different lens of why we exist. It hasn't changed our theology. It hasn't changed what we do in Bible studies, but you know what happens is what gets shared there is now people are getting the sense that not only do we care about our neighborhood, the question now is, if you move tomorrow, who would miss you? So we do two things on Sundays. One is that at the end of the service we call it a vision statement. I'm not sure I like it, but that's what we use. So at the end of the service, before the last hymn, one of us says, as a church that cares. The congregation responds by saying we live that out together through our relationships, actively discipling and bringing people to Jesus Christ. I could have had the worst sermon in the world, which is probably most of the time, or when Ted has a great sermon, which is most of the time. When we say that, people, their voices go up. They're not all living it yet, but that phrasing helps. We also use, and if you're wondering which church this is we're in Katy, Texas. No, we use creeds of different. We use Apostles' Nicene. We even like to use parts of the Catechism. Sometimes, Luther's explanation of the second article, which I think is one of the most beautiful creedal statements in the world. Anyway, but we use this thing called Ascending Creed, and it's on page 243. Where it comes from is my dad did a session many years ago with the Texas district staff when this was boiling in his heart already, and talked about God's sending nature. And a guy by the name of John Hirsch, who was on district staff, went away and wrote what he called the Sending Creed. John sent it to me, and it sat in my computer for years. And then about the time of Harvey, I went and found it, and my associate pastor and I rewrote it. It's on page 243, and it says this: God, the sending Father, the almighty creator of the cosmos, That's Ted, he loves Cosmos. Sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, to be conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He was sent to proclaim freedom. He then suffered at the hands of many, including Pontius Pilate. He was crucified, died, and buried. Within 3 days, he descended into hell to proclaim victory. And one of the reasons we also did this, I don't know for you pastors if you found this, no one ever understands he descended into hell. Every person I've met, including Lutherans, thinks he's still suffering. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, they don't understand it. It's also the least backed up doctrine that we have.
Yeah, I think it's like 1 Peter 3:18, 19. It says, he was made alive in the grave, and he went to preach good news, the kerygma, not the euangelion even, to those who were trapped in prison. But that was not a it was not a suffering thing, He descended to hell to proclaim victory and rise to life, granting God's righteousness by grace through faith. 40 days later, he ascended to heaven. He now eternally reigns at the right hand of his Father. He is judge of all the living and the dead. He gives life to all who believe in him. After the ascension, the Father and the Son sent the Holy Spirit to boldly make and call all followers of Christ to his holy apostolic church. He calls us, the community of believers who are sent to all people with power and strength, courage and gifts to proclaim the good news. As the apostles were sent, people believed. As those people believed, they too were sent. As they were sent, now we believe. And as we believe, we are sent. I think when you use words consistently, which is a blessing of our liturgy, is that people begin to take it into the head. It becomes knowledge. They hear stories, and we try to tell stories because I've got some amazing stories of other people. And people start going, and maybe it begins to go into understanding a little more. And then over time, wisdom becomes the application of that being sent. Takes time, doesn't happen overnight. But for us, what we want to be is continue to be a hub of ascending church in our little area. And as you got here today and you're thinking, why did I show up? They gave me a book. What was I thinking? I pray that the book really continues to just play with your mind in terms of just seeing your lens differently for wherever you live. Because whether you serve 4 churches in a corner of Kansas, or you're down in Corpus Christi area of Texas, or serving a western suburb, or up in southern Minnesota, God has called us to be sent together. Here's another thing: as you read the book, you got to watch for. I had no idea that the root for forgiveness is sending. Some of those words, literally, when you look at that, mean to send our sin away. Scapegoat. And so when you look at those words, God is a sending God. What does he do? He sends us into the world, but before, just back up to the cross, back up to who Jesus was and his sending. He was sent to proclaim good news, as he quotes Isaiah 40. But when he uses those words, and the specific Greek ones are in there, the base of those is to send away. He sends away our sin. And so again, it's fun to me when I read this, and as Dad would send me chapters and say, read this one, I'd go, had no idea that word sent has such an important thing. And so, where is God moving? So number 2, so I should use this outline somehow, I guess. But I love this phrase: out of God's love for the fallen world and by his gracious initiative, God sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to save the lost world that was incapable of saving itself. This is the Missio Dei, Latin for the sending, God's sending. The mission rescue act of God. The Missio Dei centers on the sending of Jesus, who in turn sends believers into the world, who together with the Father sent the Holy Spirit to empower God's people to receive and proclaim the gospel and participate in God's mission to save the lost. I use this one because if you haven't read Canoeing the Mountains, it's a wonderful leadership book. I'm sorry, he's not Lutheran. I think he's a Presbyterian. But we had our board of directors read this before COVID. It was extremely helpful to understanding when you're navigating new places. It's built on, Canoeing the Mountains is built on this. Lewis and Clark, when they went on their expedition, of course, they know what they know. So you're leaving St. Louis, Missouri, or wherever they left to go across, and you see the water comes down the Mississippi. So they carried on their expedition canoes. And they took the canoes because they assumed as they got to that watershed, they would just take the canoes and float down the other side. Not realizing what they were running across. They had no idea. So that's the basis. He uses the story. He talks about leadership exhibits by these guys. But this phrase I found so helpful to me, and this is out of his book. I didn't put the page number. I apologize. That way you have to read the whole book. It says, it's not so much that God has a mission for his church in the world, but that God has a church for his mission. Now just roll that one over in your head several times in light of God's sending. It's not so much that God has a mission for his church, but that God has a church for his mission. So the third lens I have there, mapping out the sent ones, we utilize some phrases, this is just us, to try and describe what's the missional map of each individual as a sent person. And that some might see Mike Breen and have seen his triangle with up, in, and out as a balanced map of life. We use this. Celebrate that our up is this. We clearly need to be in the Word of God, steeped in prayer, moved by the Holy Spirit. All right, we use the word cultivate, a little bit agrarian. Maybe it's because of my Wendish roots. The in, if you will, that God is not called only pastors to be on this journey, but the baptized, and the baptized to be living in concert with one another. So community, as John was saying earlier, is so important. If we can learn to live in community, and I know in some Lutheran churches really have this nailed. I mean, their ability to come together and live as community is great. The churches I served in Iowa, phenomenal. When I got to suburban Texas, horrible. But if we focus on our relationship to God, our spiritual life, part of the blessing of that undercurrent of our doctrine and theology, if we are cultivating and building relationships with one another, the statement in the scriptures, look how they love one another. If we can get out of being the Lutherans who like to fight with each other, who are distracted by things in churches and in synod, and then connect. We use that because it's really this. We understand there are people disconnected from Jesus and the church. So the sending pushes out to all those who are disconnected from Jesus and or his church. We are pretty heavily involved in a church planting effort right now. We're not doing a breakout on this, but it's called Harvest Partnership. Is what we base it on Luke 10:2, which we talked about just a moment ago. But it's an engagement that began with a couple of churches on the north side, and it kind of has two levels. There's kind of a level of those individuals we specifically, as Christ the King Kingwood and Resurrection Spring, have provided support, and that's what's here. But it also includes our relationships to others. So like Memorial Katy, I don't know if you think of yourselves as being in the Harvest Partnership, but we think of you as being that because we share things together.
That is totally accurate.
Yeah. And another lens for you to think about, and I would encourage, we love this, is that we have, I didn't even say this, I said, what's in your wallet? That's the Jennifer Garner. Love her. She's so genuine looking. She may be a pipsqueak. I don't know what she's really like, but she comes across so well in the commercial. But we talk about these 5 capitals, spiritual capital, and I won't read all that to you. But the importance, and we purposely put these in order. that if we understand how we work as a church, how I work as a pastor, as we work as a family, as we work as a harvest partnership, that we provide spiritual capital. So I know for sure, like with John and Ben, his partner in crime over there, we have spiritual capital with each other. Relational capital. To us, it's with church planters. Frankly, I love what you guys are doing in Kansas with 4 churches who are bound together. You know, how do you continue to build that relational capital when you are autonomous churches, which can become a pride issue? Can you build into we can do more together in terms of how do we partner? I'd love to hear later when we're done. How do those 4 churches partner together? How do we see the fact that we have that spiritual relationship that turns into that relational atmosphere in terms of how we reach this, if they're in the same county even, how do we reach this county for Jesus as 4 independent churches, yet people see us together almost as one because of our love for each other and our love for the community together. Intellectual capital, for us, that's important in church planting because, frankly, my dad planted lots of churches. He was his second call out of seminary. He was the lone guy going into a place in Casper, Wyoming to plant a church. And I remember people, they didn't have anywhere to go except for our basement for, it's like, oh my gosh, every night someone's in our basement meeting together. He was preparing a team of people to be that core group who would have the right rhythms of being sent. And as a kid, I didn't pay attention enough, but now that I think about it, I remember he was building a sending mentality back in the 60s into these people. He had a calling group. I love the fact I never thought about it. I never heard this anywhere else. He called their calling group who went to visit people who came to worship, but also people in the neighborhood. He called them kingdom builders. And I thought, that was in the 60s. Who thought about kingdom work? But it was really the basis for sending. They were kingdom builders. We're building the kingdom of God by being sent to our street, being sent to those who came to worship. It was an amazing thing to watch. Physical capital, for us in the Harvest Partnership, a lot of times you might think of that as buildings or things like that. It could be. For us, we do have one pastor who's raising up for Telugu Indians, people who are probably more from the Hyderabad area, that section of India. So they need our place. But our other church plants are meeting either in schools or this place that has quinceañeras and, backyards and all that stuff. So to me, physical capital means this, just time. If I had one of our not one of our essential 5 plants, but our wider group, there's a guy in the very south side of Houston, walked up to me at the front end. He said, hey, we need a constitution and bylaws. We need to figure out our governance. Will you help me? Well, of course, because if there's an ask, the answer is yes for the church planters. And we've never financially given them money, but the other 4, those capitals are going to continue to pour out, including physical. And finally, financial. And finances we put last because I think oftentimes when churches want to plant or do something, should we go to the community? The first question is, what will it cost? And I think that's the last question you ask. The other capitals need to be in play before you ever ask the question about money. That's just me. So these lenses are important, and I've kind of danced around here for a while, but the whole lens that we need to have in terms of the Missio Dei, of just understanding as we looked at the COVID situation, as we look at other things that are going, politics are going to get worse, aren't they? They ain't getting better. How do we keep people's focus off of politics and difference of politics unless they start to look at the mission of God? Second thing is just this, God's heart beating for the world. And then thirdly, what are the capitals that we're going to use? Okay, I'm over time by 2 minutes. I know that because at 10:02, my phone goes off saying, pray for workers in the harvest. So I will pray for workers in the harvest. We're officially done. You can go have a break. If you want to talk to me, great. If you want to go talk about me, better. I don't care. But thanks for being here today. Let's pray. Father, you send workers into your harvest field. What a blessing it is to be part of those who are the sent ones. We pray that you would bless us as we go out, that the words of Scripture, who we are as Lutheran missionaries, who we are to see the church being full of sent ones. It changes the direction, it changes the thinking, it changes the idea of power, and takes us out of control into being servants of your mission. We thank you for Jesus' sake. Amen. Go with God.
This is Tom Kauser, and this is the 10:30 session on Saturday, and we're in room 31, and this one is called Tear Down the Silos and Pitch a Tent. And so let's start with a word of prayer. Gracious Father, I just pray your presence in this room, and I pray that you would be with each and every soul in this year, and somehow, some way equip us for ministry. May this be a growth time for us as we explore what the future of your church looks like and how we can be your people in ministry in a world that is broken and lost and very much needs your love. We pray this in Jesus' name, amen. Probably you need to understand the context that I'm coming from, okay? Because this title is a book, and I brought. This is all I have left of the books that I bought. But I've kept a few for this morning, and I'll talk about how this book came to be. But my story goes back longer than that. I was kind of a late bloomer. That's what my dad told me the last week that I spent with him. He finally admitted, he said, you were a late bloomer. I said, I've always thought that, Dad. So thanks for confirming that. Believe it or not, I graduated from Lutheran High School East in Detroit, Michigan. There were 97 in my graduating class, and I was 92nd. Yeah, I think the other people behind me got blank diplomas, but mine was at least signed because I'd gone to summer school 2 years in a row to make up for the classes that I'd failed. And when I finally figured things out during my gap year, I wanted to go into ministry, and I wanted to be in a place where I could make a difference in the lives of kids so they wouldn't make the same mistakes that I did. Yeah. And so I went to Concordia. I went to a small little college in Detroit that would accept anybody, even me, and I did well enough there that Concordia River Forest took a chance on me. And I managed to make it through Concordia River Forest because I've had a sweet blonde girlfriend, who's now my wife, who edited everything that I did. And we had a lot of study dates, especially on Saturday nights. Friday nights we'd go to the movies. Saturday nights we'd study together. And she was not going to allow me to fail. So I graduated. But we had our placement meeting with the placement director of the college, and he looked at me, and we had just come back from student teaching, and he said, "How do you feel about a DCE call?" And I said, "I really want to teach middle school, and I want to coach basketball, and I want to, do a little bit of youth ministry stuff on the side, but that's what I really want to do." And he said, "Sometimes God has other plans for us." And so the reality is that the DC program was brand spanking new, and they were just turning out the first new DCs, and there were 2 that were graduating. And churches had heard about the program, and everybody wanted one. So there were over 20 calls, and only 2 graduating. So there were a lot of us that were round pegs that were put in a square hole. And I was one of those. But God knew what he was doing, because I spent over 25 years in DCE ministry, and then did a couple years with the Texas district overseeing youth and children's ministry at the district level. And then I got my dream job. Okay. For a person who works with teenagers, I was a high school counselor. Now, I was not the college, counselor that worked with kids, to get them into college and all that kind of stuff. Now, I was more like the dean of students counselor. So I was with the kids that were having academic issues, discipline issues, substance abuse issues. I did peer mediation, all the fun stuff. So I was working with kids that were basically a model of what I was at that age. And my colleagues always said, your favorite line is, okay, so now tell me what really happened. Because the kids would come into my office and I'd say, okay, tell me what happened. And they'd give me their story and I'd say, okay, so now tell me the real story. And they kind of look at me, how do you know? And I said, believe me, I know you're not giving me all the facts and the truth here. So anyway. And then I got to coach basketball. I was actually varsity basketball coach, and I was living the dream at Lutheran High School of Dallas. And I was part of the administrative council, so I knew things were not good because we had gone from an enrollment of 325 to 290, and every butt in the desk is like $10,000. And so we still had the same faculty. In fact, our faculty had grown a little bit. So there were going to have to be some cuts made. Never thought it would be Tom. But that's what the board's decision was. And so at age 61, I was out of a job. And nobody wants to hire a 61-year-old youth guy. And so, I looked at the options, and so I said, I'm going to take the retirement and reinvent myself. And that's what I did. And I became a writer. And my colleagues had always said, so what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, I'm going to write a book about my experience. The 7 things that parents do to screw up their kids. And so I did. I wrote the book. And I gave it, and I found an editor, and she read it, and she came back to me, and she said, you can't use the word screw up in the title. So we came up with a compromise. It's Parenting Without Guilt, Avoiding the 7 Things That Parents Do to Screw Up Their Kids. And the actual cover of the book has got 7 different kinds of screws, and in the background, that's the motif. And so I was doing parent workshops and parenting, stuff, and there's one down front. If you can, yeah, there's a stool down front. Come on down. You are.
Oh my goodness! Did I get a prize?
You have to. Well, you have to introduce yourself to the group. Now that you come down front. So who are you? Who are you, or where did you come from? And the most important thing: why are you late?
My belly was talking to me. Hey, thank you for the amens.
Okay.
I'm Mauricio Franco from Harlingen, Texas, at the border. Harlingen, Texas. Yeah.
I'm from Dallas. And I love the valley. I love the valley. Go ahead and take a seat. You've had your moment in the spotlight. Texas is an amazing state because of all the different cultures and the different topography. And the Rio Grande Valley, you drive like forever and ever and ever going south, and suddenly you think you're in the tropics because that Rio Grande Valley is it's like palm trees and cactus and there's all these farms and the best grapefruit in the world comes from the Rio Grande Valley. Texas Ruby Reds.
You know why I moved there?
Why?
They say in Texas everything is bigger, and I don't believe it.
And there's all these little border towns like Harlingen and Brownsville and McAllen, and they're all along the Rio Grande Valley. So
you hired him, didn't you?
What?
You hired him to come in late and do this.
Okay, so where was I in my story? Can you tell I'm ADD? So So anyway, about 3 years into this, because I'd always ask for questions at the end of my session, and suddenly I detected there were different issues that parents were having, and that's when I began to discover the impact that millennials were having on our culture, and how they were different than any generation before. And so I wrote a book called Passing the Torch, Sharing Faith and Values with the Millennial Generation, and that's where the Passing the Torch comes from. There's still some copies of that around somewhere. And then I wrote another book called Relevant, Churches That Relates to Millennials, which looks at the sacramental theology and how it speaks to exactly where millennials are at. And that's this one that's called Relevant. And then I was actually working on another book because I was curious, because I had friends who were millennials, who were very engaged with their church and were just doing great things. And why was it that they had stayed when others had left? And I was doing the research for that. But by the way, if you're curious, the three things were a parent who mentored them and who was really an example of discipleship. And it was almost always a dad. They talked about their dads. Number two, it was people at their church who took an interest in them and engaged with them, other than their parents. It could have been their pastor, but more likely it was a DCE, a teacher that they had in school, music director, or just a lay person who invested in them. The third thing was they talked about life-changing experiences, mission trips, and national youth gatherings, and how impactful those were. But anyway, I did the research and was starting to work on that process, and then I had a change of direction, and I thought the church needs to be thinking about what the future looks like. So I started doing the research for another book, and the more research I did, the more I felt uncomfortable with doing it, because I thought if I start talking about these issues, people are going to be uncomfortable. If I start saying, mainline denominations are going away, and probably in 20 years most of them won't even be in existence, are people going to stone me? If I tell them that in 10 years they're probably not going to be able to afford the building that they're in, are they going to get angry with me? And so I said, no, Lord, I'm not going to write that book. In August of 2019, I had hip replacement surgery. And in the recovery time, and it went well. Like my therapist, my doctors all said, you're really doing well. I was very inspired to get moving again. But the toughest challenge for me was, where's my water bottle? Well, the toughest challenge for me was I'm a type 2 diabetic and I get dehydrated and my mouth gets dry. This has been a challenge for me because I can probably have one sorbet a day and I'd like to have 5 or 6, and then there's all these cute little girls that are walking around handing them out, and how do you say no to them? So anyway, the toughest challenge that I had was sleeping at night, because I was on pain meds that gave me these, and I had to sleep flat on my back. And I'm a side sleeper, and so I could sleep maybe an hour or 2 at a time. And I learned that's when I discovered Pandora, because I would listen to Pandora at night, and I'd put on the Laura Story station or the the Amy Grant station and listen to soft Christian music, and that got me through. But anyway, in the middle of one of these nights, thought came into my head. Tear down the silos and pitch a tent. And I thought, huh? And it was very, very clear, and it took me, I think, 2 or 3 nights to begin to connect the dots. God was telling me, Tom, you need to write that book. And so that's how the book came into being. So that's kind of the backstory to how I got to this point. And so where's my clicker? Here it is. Okay, ready for some stimulating talk? The concept comes from the book of Genesis, when God called Abraham to go to different places. And every time Abraham moved, what did he do? He listened, he obeyed, he went there, and he pitched a tent, and he built an altar. And I firmly believe that's what God is calling us to do today. He's calling us to move out of our silos, venture out into the world, pitch tents there, because tents are temporary, okay? And the world is constantly changing, so we don't need to be building any more structures. If you want a church, there's plenty of vacant ones around to buy, okay? Sorry, LCEF. And that's...
a lot of commercial real estate available right now, too.
Yeah, a lot of commercial real estate that can be retrofitted. Yeah. And then once we've established a location, to build an altar there and invite the people who live around that spot to come and pray and be introduced to God's Word and worship. And so that's where the title comes from. Because silos are cylindrical structures that are used for storage. And God never intended for His church to be a storage place for Christians, for His people. And the image that I recall is for many years I served churches in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, just south of Perryville. I think they sent me there because I needed to be certified as LCMS, because when I was so close to Perry County. I actually spoke at a birthday banquet in the Walther League Hall in Altenburg. And I remember asking the pastor there, I said, about his evangelism program. He says, we don't need one. He says, there are only 2 people in town that aren't Lutheran, and we've been trying for years.
There are 2 Lutheran churches there.
Yeah. What?
There are 2 Lutheran
Yeah.
churches
Oh yeah.
in Altenburg.
Oh yeah. There's the other guys too. Anyway. And then we were 2 different congregations in the Chicago area, Downers Grove and Dundee, and then we moved to Texas in 1988, and I took a position at Holy Cross in Dallas, and was there 7 years, spent 2 years with the Texas district, and then the high school. But anyway, when we were living in Chicago, my wife's family was from St. Louis. And back in the early 70s, before Interstate 55 was the route to go, you had to take old Route 66. And Route 66, love the movie Cars, because it brings back the memories of Route 66. Anyway, there goes my ADD again. All these little towns are along there, and the Illinois Central Mainline exactly parallels the highway. And every town had grain elevators, silos. And you always had to have at least 3 kinds of silos, because they grow corn, and they grow wheat, and they grow soybeans. And you can't mix the wheat and the soybeans and the corn. Yeah. And if you look beyond that, which you could do in Illinois because it's flat. I mean, you could see 50 miles if you look in either direction. But if you looked into the town, you saw other silos. You saw a Baptist silo. You saw a Methodist silo. You saw a Presbyterian silo. You saw a Lutheran silo. You saw a Catholic silo. You saw all these little church steeples, And they were all doing good things probably in that town, but they didn't mix. But that was the silo ministry. Even growing up on the east side of Detroit, I grew up on the east side of Detroit, East Warner Drive, if there's any Michiganders here. Went to Lutheran High School East. There were silos all around us, And the silos, there were 2 Lutheran churches within about a mile of my house. And they both had large parish schools. And they both were very much silo ministries. There was Peace on East Warren and Bethany on Outer Drive. And they were bitter rivals when it came to basketball. Somehow those kids all went to high school together and merged into one group. But don't ever talk about working together, because we are Lutherans and we do things our way. And Bethany did their way and Peace did their way. And Bethany's barely hanging on and Peace is closed. And that's what happens with silo ministry. Because God never intended for His church to be a structure. The church is the people of God. So what's happened? Why is this happening? These are the realities. Mainline denominations are going away. There's fewer workers. Our buildings have been devalued. And the traditional way of doing ministry no longer works in contemporary culture. Mainline denominations. In 1970, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was almost 3 million. Anybody know what it is today? How big is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod today? Today, what? 1.5. It's a little less than 1.5. Roughly half the size of what it was in 1970. Now here's an interesting. It was about 1974, 1975. I was 3 years into my ministry at Emmanuel in Downers Grove. And I knew there was a wedding that afternoon, but I had some things to get done to get ready for Sunday morning, so I was in the office Saturday morning, and Bill Huner, the pastor, was in getting ready for the wedding. And Bill was just going around church singing hymns, and he was just, and Bill did not like doing weddings. He loved working with the couples, but he didn't like all the drama that went with the weddings. And Bill was in a great mood, because he, and I said, Bill, what's going on? Because he said, I have been at this church almost 4 years. And this is the first time, he said, I've done probably dozens and dozens of weddings. This is the first time that I have a Lutheran marrying a Lutheran. 1970 began the decline of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and every mainline denomination. Why was that? Because baby boomers started graduating from college. They were the first generation where a majority of them went to college, and that meant being introduced to all different kinds of cultures and religions. And suddenly, the Walther League went out of existence, which was a real, the dating game for, Lutherans, if you talk to anybody over the age of 75, and they're married, they probably tell you they met in Walther League. Well, the Walther League didn't exist anymore, and you had a generation of kids who were coming out of college who were marrying Methodists and Baptists, and the Baptists were marrying Presbyterians, and the Catholics were marrying, Episcopalians, and what are you going to do? You're not going to join the Lutheran Church or the Baptist Church if you're Lutheran and Baptist. And that was the beginning of megachurches, the independent non-denominational churches, because that became a real fertile ground for that kind of a church. So that's, and don't get me wrong, I think probably 20 years from now the LCMS will still be in existence, but it's going to be much smaller than it is today, and probably look very, very different than it does today, and we need to be ready for that. Fewer full-time workers, If you go to our seminary campuses now, there's dorms, but they're empty. And they're not graduating near the pastors that they once were. And if you think of the number of pastors who are over the age of 50 and 60, it's pretty bleak in terms of if you're a church that's going to be vacant 10 years from now, finding a pastor is going to be really, really difficult. It's already difficult to get pastors to move. And I was sharing with somebody last night, I'm a DCE, but at this point in time, I'm not so sure that I would encourage a student in college to go into DCE ministry. Because, I think some churches are not going to be able to afford them in the future. And you're going to see more tent makers, dual career. Our buildings have been devalued. One of the realities is, churches have mortgages. What's going to happen as membership declines, giving drops, and we still got this mortgage. And plus, if a building is 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years old, it needs maintenance. It's a negative sign when more money has to be spent on maintenance and repair than it is on evangelism and outreach. And there's another reality we don't like to think about, but that is, there's a pretty good possibility somewhere down the road, could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 15 years, that churches are going to lose their tax-exempt status. And what's going to happen when we have to start paying property tax on our buildings? And what is that going to do to a church? And the bottom one is the traditional way of doing parish ministry doesn't work. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, and I remember Sunday school in the church that I went to in St. James, which was in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Sunday school openings were in the church basement, and it was packed. It was packed. There probably were 300 kids, in Sunday school. The traditional way of doing ministry was we baptized children, and they went into the cradle roll, and you went into the church, and here was the cradle roll, and the children on the cradle roll were all listed there. And then they went into Sunday school, and they went from Sunday school to confirmation class, and they were confirmed, and they went into the youth group. And we maybe didn't see them for a few years because they went off to college, and they sowed their wild oats and whatever they did, But they always came back to church. Why? Because they needed to be married. And then, they kind of hung around on the fringe a little bit, but as soon as the first child was born, there they were back to have the child baptized, and the cycle continued, and it perpetuated itself. And we really didn't need to worry about evangelism because we were growing just by baptizing kids. But that style of ministry hasn't worked probably for 40 years. But many churches still operate with that mindset. And as I drive around and look at churches in North Dallas, it's not just a Lutheran thing. There are, I bet probably 10 to 12 churches that I drive by regularly that have either closed or the parking lots are pretty vacant on Sunday morning. And I look at them, and they've got a nice sanctuary with this education wing and probably no kids. Yeah. The traditional way of doing ministry does not work. We can do it that way, but there's no future in it. Okay, let's talk. Let's talk about the first one. How have you? What I'm saying? How have you seen it played out in your context?
The ones that are in our Sunday school class, the parents bring them to Sunday school and pick them up out in the parking lot as soon as Sunday school's over, and then our kids go over, they're going to end up doing the same thing when they get converted and have kids, and they'll bring their kids to Sunday school after being baptized. And
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I think if we are in these moments where we find ourselves, we need to be reminded that Christ is still in control.
Oh yeah.
And that throughout the history of the church, there's been a consistency, and there's a reason for that. I think it's let us know, hey, you are not in control. Pandemic has taught us that too. You're not in control. So I think throughout the history too of the church, you see where the church has done this, hiding in the caves, coming out, going in, coming out. It depends also on the geographical location you are in.
Yeah.
And I think in this situation that we find ourselves, we have to understand that the church has not progressed as the culture has progressed. So you have the confession, but you have not brought the missional, not just the confessional missional, but the missional part that brings that confession in the actual way of presenting. That's why you don't have the children.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is the traditional way. Thank God for the traditional way.
Yeah.
And when we talk about traditional, when I spoke in the Texas Convention, I say, what tradition you mean? 2 years ago? Martin Luther time? Jesus time? What is the traditional way? I mean, because some people hold on tight to the collar, into the ring. And I think when we talk about traditional, I had to let them dive. In my church, we have very traditional Lutherans that don't know the Bible at all. They don't know their confession at all. And in every country, Chicago, Wisconsin, where I live on Arkansas, and I think we had to let them die with dignity. I mean, they had dignity, and I love those people because if you look in your offerings, they are the ones that.
And one of the things that I want to make it clear that in spite of all of the things that I've said, I'm extremely optimistic about the future of the church.
Amen.
Because God is in charge.
That's right.
Yeah. And churches will still have a place in this world, but it's going to look vastly different, and that's what I think we need to be talking about. And when I talk about the future church, I'm going to talk about cornerstone churches, which are traditional churches in their role. So anyway,
I'll throw out one. So here's the first question. So we at our church, like I've been at our church in California there for 25, 30 years. So 25 years ago or something, we had a great building program. We built, a gorgeous multi-purpose room, that we can do all kinds of sports in and have, large music worship events and that kind of thing. And a beautiful sanctuary and whatnot. We were doing like over 200 people, on a Sunday and that sort of thing. Everything looked great guns. Now we're down, we do like 40 people on a Sunday plus 20 online. And it's all, like you said, it's all old people. We're all still given, 10%. So, we're hanging on barely with one pastor, no other staff, literally. So,
anybody else see a similar?
The other thing I was going to say with that was that one of the reasons was so many people, for some reason, it got, the hypocrisy of the church drove them away over the years. You know, I got neighbors and stuff, you know, that said my church was, my father was a pastor, and I just didn't, when he died, you know, at a young age, you know, the hypocrisy of the church, you know, in their response to that, so I don't think they'll ever go back into the church.
Yeah.
And I'm at the same church, but what we're also seeing, because we're in the Silicon Valley, is that families are moving out of the area because they can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of families have left our church because they have moved out of California because they cannot afford.
They're coming to Texas.
They are. We are.
Texas and
That moved to
Oklahoma both.
Texas, some to
I'll be there
Ohio,
soon.
a lot to Idaho, you know. So we have kind of what Tom said, plus the fact of just the whole financial aspect of it.
Yeah, Texas doesn't have a state income tax. That's one of the attractive things.
I've been doing some pulpit supply at a church that's in the LA County. You know, beautiful church, big church, great location, is worshiping 10 people. You know, and I'm probably, when I go in, I'm probably one of the younger people in the congregation. But they can afford to keep the building and keep doing that because on Saturdays they rent it out to the Seventh-day Adventists who fill the place and give them enough money that they can continue doing what they've always done until they're down to like zero, because the congregation didn't change and adapt as the community changed around them.
One more, and then we're going to move on.
That's kind of what's happened to our church. The demographic changed, and the people that have moved in, I mean, they're fantastic people, but they don't relate to Lutheran because they're all Catholic, and I don't even think they're really Catholic. They're just Catholic by name only, but they would never go into a Lutheran church because that would be heresy in their minds, and so they just stay out of the church, and we can't get them. It's really hard. I mean, we have both English and Spanish. Our English church is shrunk down to maybe 30, 20 sometimes, and our Spanish is shrunk down to, I've heard numbers down at 9 now. You would think the Spanish would just be taking off, but it's not.
Maybe one more thing I would like to add to that. I think you talked about the silos of different denominations. I haven't heard in any of these presentations about the race too. You know, these days the demography is not about denominations, but also the race. The culture is changed. We have to be prepared for that too, because I have a congregation in Lancaster. We do church plantation, okay, and then we want to work with LCMS and partner with the Caucasian churches, and then when we approach some of them, they don't even open their doors, okay. We have to go with the demography, not only religious demography, cultural also. We have to open our doors. Instead of closing the church, bring other culture into this. And then that's another piece I don't hear. You know, I think it's sometimes, yes, it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but we have to face it. We have to talk about it as well.
In our church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, we opened it up and we have African ministry and trying to merge those two congregations because that service was in Swahili. And my husband would preach at it and have it translated. Do you know what I mean? And so then some native people from their country would come and they were refugees. And I could just talk for the rest of the afternoon about trying to merge these two congregations. Very, very limited success. I mean, it's extremely difficult. And to start merging, having white people attend the Swahili service and the black, you know, it's just very difficult.
That's another topic that can be discussed in a different topic. But the thing is, don't try to mix the first generation because there are cultural barriers, language barriers, but work on the second generation. How are we going to bring our young kids together through Sunday school and then set a platform for the next generation? I think that's where the strategy has to be systematically shifted.
Okay, let's move on. I want you to think about, you know, and in some ways, you know, when I first saw it, I was scheduled for the last session, you know. I thought, is anybody going to still be around? You know, obviously that's not an issue. but then I got to thinking, this is the session you're going to go home with, okay? And as you go home today, I want you to be thinking about, what is your church going to look like in 10 years? Yeah. That's what we need to be thinking about. And that's why the book has got a study guide, so you can give it to your church council, your elders, and there's it's lead them through a 4-session processing the stuff that I'm talking about, because that's the beginning of recognizing the need to do things differently. Okay, post-pandemic, 3 types of churches. And post-pandemic, I mean probably within the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, mega churches, cornerstone churches, and terminal churches. Mega churches, we understand that. Boy, do I understand that. I go to Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Carrollton. Prince of Peace has 33 acres. We have a Christian school, we got a nice worship center, great fellowship center, but almost across the street from us is Prestonwood Baptist Church, the largest Baptist church in the country, where they will worship 15 to 20,000 a weekend. They've got a 140-acre campus with what they call Main Street, where they've got a food court, bookstore, clothing store, where you can buy their, Prestonwood apparel. They operate a big Christian school with a fantastic football stadium and baseball field and softball fields and a health club. And we also have Bentry Bible Fellowship within a half a mile of us that is Prestonwood on a smaller scale. Those are mega churches. Mega churches are Protestant Christian churches that worship 2,000 or more a month or a week, and we just need to see them for what they are. It was interesting in 1970s. I was in Chicago, and there was a group of Chicago youth workers that kind of got together a couple times a year for training events. And one of the key leaders in planning those training events was a young pastor by the name of Bill Hybels, who was a youth pastor. And Bill was just starting a new ministry for a church in Arlington Heights at Willow Creek Movie Theater, a movie theater that had closed. And he took it over and turned it into a youth center. And Willow Creek Theater grew to become Willow Creek Community Church in this magnificent campus, which when I took a call to Dundee was very, very close to us. And everybody, when Bill Hybels started expanding this ministry, this mega church ministry, our leaders were all up, and I was, what are we going to do about this? And I had kids from my youth group that would go to Wednesday night things at Willow Creek, and then be with us on Sunday morning. And I thought, let's just, and I had some friends that I met from over there, and I'd go over and talk to them, and over time, we had some folks come from Willow Creek to Bethlehem Lutheran Church, because they said, we really want the intimacy of Sunday morning. So mega churches are okay. We just need to recognize that reality. Cornerstone churches. Cornerstone churches are churches that follow a traditional denomination, and they typically worship 200 or more a week. What makes them cornerstone churches is that they are going to be more viable going forward because they're cross-generational, they're engaged with their community, they're doing community ministry, they offer multiple options in terms of worship styles, and they encourage a missional lifestyle. And on a Sunday morning at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Carrollton, Texas, Micah Miller, our lead pastor, who's a great teaching pastor, and that's one of the keys to I think, a Cornerstone Church, will remind us in some form or another that the church is not a battleship. The church is an aircraft carrier. Where you land on Sunday morning, you're refueled, you're serviced, and then you're launched to do mission work. And every single person in our church is called to do ministry where you work, where you live, and where you play. That's a Cornerstone Church. And my prayer is that, this is you, okay? Because the other type of church is a terminal church. Thom Rainer of, what's his name? Annie, he's Baptist, but I'm trying to think of the name of his ministry. Anyway, he's a church consultant and writer, and he says that in the next 5 to 10 years, 40% of the churches in this country Protestant churches in this country will close. Yeah. They're terminal. And there's two common themes that make churches terminal, other than declining attendance. They focus more on holding traditions than they do reaching the lost, and they fail to respond to the changes in the community and the culture. And they're living in a silo. And what's going to happen is the people who are part of these communities, who still want to be Lutheran, are going to go to the Cornerstone churches, and that's going to sustain those Cornerstone churches. So where in a community now there might be 6 churches, 10 years from now there might be 1 or 2. Yeah. That's just the reality, because churches are terminal. Yeah. So, can any of you think examples of this in your community? Let me tell you some of the stories about your communities and what you're seeing. Yeah.
We have, we're the biggest town in our town. We have 2,100 people in our town with 5 churches. So we've seen, there's 2 of them that are holding on by a thread. That it's, they share a pastor actually now between the 2 churches because they can't each pay to have him ministered.
Yeah.
And for the same reasons, they don't want to make any changes. And at our church itself, we had seen a decline at first because we were the traditional church, and I was guilty of it too. I've been a member of it since '91, and we didn't want to make any changes to the prayers. We didn't need the book. We could say it by heart. And then when our new pastor came, he's like, nope, we're gonna get some digital stuff. We're gonna have some online services, and we went from having maybe down to 40 people coming in for church to now we're back up to about 135 weekly and growing. We have people who have heard of him and well, I like that it's not the original. Everyone's just saying it because of memory, not because they feel it. That's
kind of runs counter, The old thing, how many Lutherans does it change a light bulb? 50? 50? 1 to turn the light bulb and 49 to talk about how good the old one was.
Or change. Lutherans don't change.
No, they don't change. Yeah.
I think in one of the slides was about cross-generational. I think I want to add to your thing. I think it's cross-generational, also multi-generational. I think if the church is moving, one of the biggest languages is being spoken at home. in each state is not English.
Mm.
The majority of, you got Chinese, and you got Spanish, and you have other Asian.
One of the turnoffs, if a millennial or Gen Z come into your worship service, and everybody there is Anglo, they probably won't be back, because that does not reflect the culture.
Community. Yeah, that's when I moved to Texas. There was no Hispanic pastor when I came. So people say I came because you are there.
Yeah.
And I say, can I do a Hispanic ministry? The pastor says, no, it's only one ministry. It's only, I don't care where it's coming from, it's one ministry. And that's beautiful. But I think the understanding the other culture, your community, the buildings are not big. We're building adding to our building a $4 million investment to do a third space idea, like Starbucks. So we're gonna do 10 cents coffee, so they can come over, do their homework, hotspot and everything. So the buildings are good if you know how to be a good steward of it. We also have a tent church. We have a tent church that every Sunday, tear down, put up, it has to do that. It's growing faster than the church that has a building.
Yeah.
And
Trinity Church in Trinity Lutheran in Lisle, Illinois, bought a I think it was a Walgreens that had closed, and retrofitted it to coffee shop with a play area and then a worship center attached to it. But the whole thing is, it's designed to be a community gathering point,
And if you want to reach the first to the babies, to the kids, you have to have something attractive for them.
Yeah.
The parents, if you have a
So-
couple,
So anyway, be thinking about where your church fits into this. Now, there is a fourth option. That's a legacy church. A legacy church is a church that, well, the definition is here. It's a church that recognizes that they are terminal and says, we want to leave a legacy. We acknowledge the fact that we're going to probably disband and close, but we want something new to come out of this. Can you talk about new thing?
Being the LCEF guy here, new thing, and it's a church in the Baltimore area. First of all, there's a Baltimore Lutheran school, which many individuals had graduated.
Concordia Prep, yeah.
Well, Baltimore Lutheran started,
yeah.
and then they became Concordia Prep and opened the doors because Baltimore Lutheran, as Baltimore Lutheran, was shrinking and disappearing. When they opened it up to Concordia Prep, more individuals became part of it. First Lutheran church in Baltimore recognized that they were an aging church. And we talked to them about, what kind of a legacy do you want to leave? And their leadership, I mean, there's this woman there, she's probably, Betty is probably, 94 years old? And I'll tell you what, she makes a cup of coffee nervous, but she recognized that she brought everybody into the fold that says, listen, our average age is probably over 70. We're not growing. What are we going to do about it? And they started this relationship with Concordia Prep, and they brought on a pastor to do a new start. And he came from Texas, I believe. His son's sitting right here.
This is their tech guy right here. It's interesting. One of the first things that Peter did was develop an app, a phone app, because that's the future of communicating with members. A phone app where they have constant. Where's my phone? It's on my phone. Where they can watch services on their phone. And they can chat with their pastor, on their phone. So yeah, thanks for. I didn't want to blow his horn, so.
No. You know, as you mentioned earlier, one of the things, if you don't know LCEF has available to you, they have a free demographics package called Mission Insight, and it's available. And I get a chance to go into churches and sit down with their leadership. One of the most hilarious things that I get to do is sit down and give them a quiz on tell me about your neighborhood, tell me who's in your community. I ask about a series of 10 questions, and if they answer it, they are probably a magnitude off in what the true answer is. They don't know their community. They drive 40 minutes to come to a church that, you know, maybe they started before they moved away, but they don't know their community. And if you don't know your community, how can you? You know, you talked about the battleship, or I like to say that a lot of our churches are like ant farms. They're contained, they make holes, they take care of each other, but they can't get out or won't get out to touch their neighborhoods and their communities.
Yeah.
We've got a situation where we came back after 30 years, or after 26 years of being gone, to the first church that my husband was called to. And we've been back for 4 years. But there are 3 other churches, and if you take the circle of them, all of them are within a 10-mile radius of the center. They are so close, but this is a rural community. The largest population of the 4 communities is probably 350 people. And the other 3 are not over 50. And yet, no one wants to give up their church, because it's been talked about as bringing the 4 of them together, but no one wants to give up their church.
Yeah.
It's okay if everyone comes to my church.
Yeah. That's the epitome of a terminal church. Somebody got their Bible app?
Yes, sir.
Let's hear Acts 1:48. This is the Great Commission.
Acts 1:4.
We know the Matthew 28. I like this Great Commission.
On one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will baptize with the Holy Spirit. Then they gathered around him and asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He said to them, It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
So Jesus tells them, you're going to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And their response is, so does this mean you're going to restore the church? Does this mean we're going to go back to the way things were? And Jesus says, no. I want you to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. Yeah. I just finished the manuscript on a new book. It's going to be short, okay? It's a Bible study. Probably 40 to 50 pages, 4-session Bible study on the book of Jonah. The title of the book is The Jonah in Us. And Jonah is the only book in the Bible that ends with a question. What's the question?
Should we not be concerned?
Don't I have the right to care about those people? Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to leave his town to go to a place to talk to those people, because Jesus, you might actually love them and you might actually forgive them. Yeah. They might actually repent. And the other thing is, what are my friends going to say if they found out I talked to them? Yeah. The question for us today is, where is your Nineveh? Where is God calling you to go that you don't want to go to because you don't want those people to know Jesus? Or you're afraid that they might become your friends? God is calling us to different places to do ministry. And it's outside of our silos. He wants us to pitch tents. And the rest of the story is this, that when they gathered around food in their homes, they gained favor with their neighbors. Their neighbors joined them in the church group. And how different would your neighborhood look? I heard this in a workshop yesterday. If everybody in their neighborhood took 4 lawn chairs and moved them into their front yard. How different would your life look if you took that nice barbecue grill and those lawn chairs and all that furniture that you have and your patio inside the security fence, the privacy fence that you have, if you moved all that stuff into your front yard and actually got to know your neighbors? I came out of that workshop yesterday with John Denninger and I said, you know, I'm going to get a stack of 3x5 cards, and I'm going to have a 3x5 card for every house in my neighborhood, because I want to know everybody's name and who they are, and I want to know the names of their kids, and I want to know what they do for a living. And I want to get to know them. Now, I got a pretty good start, because what happened during the pandemic is I couldn't see my church family. So I started walking and prayer walking in the neighborhood, and I started meeting, you know. And the ones that I got closest to were the moms, because I live on a corner, and our street goes, the street on the side of our house goes into a little cul-de-sac. And the moms would gather in the afternoon, and sit in the shade because it's hot in Texas, and they were sitting, you know, so they'd be sitting in their lawn chairs or sitting on the curb, and the kids were all playing in the cul-de-sac in the street, and I'd go by and talk to them and got to know the kids and the moms and got intertwined with their life, and you had a chance to pray with a couple of them, and then the dads would come home from work and I got to know them. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be pitching tents, and you know, and instead of worrying about, well, can I get them to come to my church? No. We don't want them to come to I don't want them to come to my church. I want them to know Jesus. The future is getting people to know Jesus. Because every Sunday morning, I go to an aircraft carrier where I land, and I'm reminded over and over again that that's your mission. So get out there and do it. The day will come. The days will come when people the days when people will come to us are past. Why can't I read that? Yeah, people aren't going to come to our church anymore. We got to go to them. The future lies in reaching where they live, work, play. That means tearing down silos and pitching tents. Go ahead, time. Okay. Am I doing all right on time? Okay, I think what?
It's 11:35.
Okay. Let me tell you my Starbucks story. Sure. Okay. I'm a writer, and as a writer, I like to write in Starbucks because so I. At least one day a week, and sometimes 2, I go to Starbucks and write because that's where my audience hangs out. There's a lot of Gen Zs working in Starbucks, And there's a lot of, it's interesting, one of the little ladies that, young ladies that, this is pre-pandemic that I met, her office was there. She was there every day officing at Starbucks. And I got to know her, and I asked her one day what she did, and she sells women's accessories. And in 2019, she did over $1 million in sales. And I said, so what do you do about inventory? And she said, I don't have any inventory. She said, I have suppliers online. So she's just a middle person, but she's doing all this at Starbucks, sitting on a laptop computer, and she works probably 4 hours a day, and then she goes and does her other stuff, and she's making $1 million a day, and she's probably 25, 26, 27 years old, cute as a button, But anyway, she was one of my Starbucks group. But then I got to know a lot of the staff there, that worked there, and got intertwined with their lives and started learning about what was going on with them. And they knew what I did, and they started calling me Pastor Tom. And I didn't want to tell them I'm not a pastor. I didn't want to go through that whole explanation, so that was fine. So anyway, then the pandemic hits, and I can't go to Starbucks because they're closed. And so I was writing at home in the family room, and which is all right. I mean, I got a nice, nice comfortable recliner that I can sit in, and my coffee is just as good as theirs. In fact, I buy Starbucks and grind it myself. I like, I like the darkest coffee you can get. So yeah, it's either Sumatran or one of those, Anyway. But I went by Starbucks one day and I noticed the drive-thru was open. So I thought, well, I'll just go through the drive-thru. And so I ordered my Grande Pike, which is, I guess, same thing every time. Don't put anything in my coffee. If God wanted cream in coffee, he'd have put it in there, okay? And don't put any of that fluffy syrup in there, because that just sweetens it, and I'm a diabetic, and I shouldn't be having that stuff. Just give me my black coffee, okay? So when I get up to the window and I reach for my cup, and this little gal in the window, she screams, and she says, "It's Pastor Tom!" And all of a sudden, all these faces are in the window. And they want to know how I am. And they're telling me how much they miss me. And when are you coming back? I said, as soon as you open. Yeah. That's what we need to be doing. Now, I'm back in Starbucks, but it's a whole different, so I'm having to reestablish relationships. And my little entrepreneurial young lady, I haven't seen her, but it's coming. It's been about 2 months that I'm back at Starbucks. But that's what it means to pitch a tent and build an altar. Yeah. Because when I go into Starbucks, I open this sucker up, get out my Bible, put it down, get out my laptop, open it up, and the Bible sitting there is a door opener. Yeah. There's my contact information if you want it. Andrew, you want to hand this stuff out? I want to share with you an opportunity, yeah, and then come back and get the other one. The books are $5, and I got a few of them, so first come, first serve. You got a customer? You got one. There's two, so okay. My wife is going to be so happy because I'm coming home with a wallet full of money and I don't have any books.
Can I put a picture of one of those behind the cat?
Yeah, and you can get it on Amazon. So okay, those are the three. Yeah, it's on Amazon. So and this one was actually published by Amazon Kindle Direct. So it's actually an Amazon product. This is a new venture that I've gotten involved with. You know Tina?
very well.
Yes, and Tina and I have hooked up, and it's a program that we're calling Ministry Mastermind, and what we're looking for is, roughly 6 to 8 people. It could be pastors, could be church leaders who are in situations. This is if you want to unload her ebook. Andrew's got cards so you can use the barcode and unload the ebook that kind of goes into detail on how this whole system works. But the hope is to bring these 6 to 8 people together via Zoom, and once a month we're looking for people who are in situations where they see the need to change, but they don't know how. And we want to bring those people together to begin to do some strategic planning, and there'll be some coaching along the way by either Tina or myself. And for 6 months we'll meet once a month, but do very, very specific goal setting each time we meet. So the next time we meet, the other people in the group are going to be hearing reports from you in terms of how things have gone. My hope is that at the end of that, we'll develop some long-term coaching relationships to bring about change. So that's what this is. So if you're interested, the information's on there, and or pass it on to your pastor. The other thing that I have, if you're interested, I do a weekly newsletter. Comes out every Monday morning at 6 o'clock Dallas time, so it's 5 o'clock Eastern time. It's a Passing the Torch news. It's topical, but it relates to ministry to Gen Zs and millennials. For instance, one of the more recent ones was on who is influencing Gen Zs, who are the cultural influencer. Number 1 was Khloe Kardashian, number 2 was Kanye West, number 3 was Taylor Swift. And it's interesting, all 3 of those in some form or another talk about their faith, but it's, I think it's more a marketing tool than there's anything else. What can we learn from those 3 folks? And what can we be doing that they're doing to become influencers? So that's what it talks about. I've also done one on Christian nationalism and how Christian nationalism is a turnoff to young people. So those are the kinds of dishes that I do. If you're interested in the newsletter, all I need is your name and email address. I'll put you on the list. It's free, okay? If you don't like it, or don't like what I'm saying, people unsubscribe regularly because I offend somebody, and that's okay. But if you're interested in getting the newsletter, it's just all I need is that, and so it comes out every Monday morning. And if you don't read it on Monday, you'll get a reminder on Thursday, and it'll come again. So anyway, God, thanks for hanging with me. You guys are awesome, and I see some nodding of heads, and I think some of you are probably a little uncomfortable, but that's okay. Yeah, go ahead.